Welcome back, beloved soul. Today we continue our Pillars of Character series with episode 7. This story is a dramatization inspired by scripture, and it explores a truth many of us wrestle with. Justice is not always the same as fairness. Justice is not shaped by emotion or loyalty. Justice asks us to hold to what is true, even when feelings collide. In the ancient world, judgment took place at the city gate. It was a sacred threshold where community life was protected and order was preserved. Today's story brings you into one of those moments. A widow, a young man, a divided crowd, and an elder who must decide what is right when everyone believes they deserve more than they lost. May this story help you see justice with new clarity, not as punishment or perfection, but as the courage to weigh truth with restraint and civility. Let your heart be open. Let wisdom meet you where you are.
The morning sun had not yet climbed above the eastern hills when Shimon walked the familiar path toward the gate at Beit Adom, his sandals pressed against stones worn smooth by generations of feet, by merchants driving their carts, by shepherds guiding their flocks, by children running messages, by elders like himself who had walked this way 1,000 times before. The air carried the scent of baking bread from the ovens near the market square, and the fainter smell of sheep dung from the pens beyond the threshing floor. Somewhere a rooster called its final morning cry, late and hoarse, like an old man remembering something he had meant to say. Shimon was not a young man. His beard had long since surrendered its color to the pale gray of early winter, and his back no longer held the straightness of his youth. He had sat at this gate for nearly 30 years, first beside his father, then beside other elders who had since gone to their rest, and now often alone, except when matters required the full counsel. He had learned that judgment was less about knowing the law and more about understanding the shape of a quarrel, the way grief bends a person toward anger, the way shame makes even honest men speak in circles. This morning, he sensed, would require all of that understanding. A dispute had been brewing for 3 days between the widow Tirzah and a young man named Nadav, and what had begun as a private grievance had swelled into something the whole village had begun to claim as their own. Shimon had seen this pattern before. When a community divides itself into camps, when neighbors begin speaking only to those who share their outrage, the dispute itself becomes almost secondary to the battle being waged around it. The original wound gets lost beneath layers of loyalty and accusation, and by the time it reaches the gate, the elder is asked to judge not merely what happened, but which side deserves to win. He settled himself on the worn stone bench beneath the spreading terebinth tree that shaded the eastern side of the gate. The trunk of that tree was thick as a man's embrace, and its branches reached outward like arms offering shelter. Shimon's father had told him that the tree had been planted by the very first elder to sit in judgment here, though whether that was truth or legend, no one could say. What mattered was that the tree remained, that its shade fell across the place of judgment, and that people remembered they stood beneath something older than their quarrels. They came in clusters, the way people do when they have already chosen sides. On one side stood those who had known Tirzah all her life, who remembered her late husband Azrael and mourned him still, who had watched her bury him 2 winters past and struggle alone to maintain her small plot of land and her modest grain stores. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, her face lined by labor and loss, her eyes carrying the permanent shadow that settles upon those who have known too much grief. She stood now at the front of her supporters, her hands pressed flat against her thighs, as though holding herself steady against an invisible wind. On the other side stood Nadav, a young man of perhaps 20 summers, broad in the shoulders and uncertain in the face. His father had been a respected herdsman who had died suddenly 4 years ago, leaving Nadav to manage the family's small flock of goats alone. He was not a man given to cruelty, but something had gone wrong, and now he stood here with his face flushed and his jaw tight, surrounded by those who believed he was being treated unfairly by a village too quick to pity a widow. Between these two groups stood those who had not yet decided, or who had come simply to watch. Among them were merchants hoping to open their stalls soon, mothers holding young children by the hand, old men who remembered 100 disputes and were curious to see how this one would unfold. They shifted and murmured, their voices like the rustling of leaves before rain. Shimon raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. "I have been told," he said, "that there is a matter requiring judgment between Tirzah." Tirzah stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was not the trembling voice Shimon had expected. It was steady and sharp, with the edge of someone who had rehearsed her words many times. "Elder, I come seeking what is owed to me. 8 days ago, this man's goats broke through the fence that separates our lands. They entered my grain storage and destroyed what I had set aside for the coming winter. 3 full measures of barley. Gone. I have nothing left from that store." Her voice cracked, and for a moment the steadiness faltered. "My husband is gone. I have no sons to work the fields. That grain was to sustain me until next harvest, and it is gone." A murmur of sympathy rippled through her side of the crowd. Someone called out, "She speaks the truth. We saw it." Another voice added, "Make him pay double, as the law requires for a thief." Shimon held up his hand again, and the voices quieted. "Nadav, son of Yoshnan, you have heard the complaint. What is your answer?" Nadav stepped forward. His hands were clenched at his sides, and his voice came out rougher than perhaps he intended. "I do not deny that my goats entered her land. The fence that divides our fields has been weak for years. That week, after the rains, a section collapsed. My goats found the gap during the night. When I discovered them the next morning, I drove them back immediately." He paused, and his eyes found Tirzah's face briefly before sliding away. "But 3 full measures? Elder, that storage shed was small and poorly sealed. I saw what remained inside. There was damage, yes, I do not deny it, but she is claiming more than was lost. And now she demands I pay her 5 measures in return, saying the law requires it. 5 measures would take everything I have. She would ruin me to make herself whole from a loss that was not even that great." The crowd on his side surged forward with noise. "She wants to see him driven off his land." Tirzah's supporters pushed back with their own chorus. "He calls her a liar. His animals, his responsibility. Would he say this if her husband still lived?" Shimon watched the sound rise like water against a riverbank, watched it threaten to overflow into something ugly. He had seen it happen before, how a judgment seat could transform into a place of battle if the one presiding let the crowd believe that volume was persuasion. "Enough." Shimon's voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of years, and the crowd fell still. "I will hear from those who saw the damage, not those who have opinions, those who saw." 3 witnesses came forward, one by one. The first was an older woman named Nama, who lived beside Tirzah's plot. She had seen the goats in the morning, counted at least 6 of them inside the storage area. She described the scattered grain, the broken vessels, the mess that remained. Her sympathies clearly rested with Tirzah, and her voice trembled with indignation as she spoke. The second witness was a young man who worked occasionally for both parties. He confirmed that he had seen the aftermath of the damage, but added, quietly and with obvious reluctance, that the storage area had not been entirely full when he had last seen it several weeks earlier. Tirzah's supporters hissed at him. He lowered his eyes and backed away quickly. The third witness was a grain merchant from the market who had been called in to assess the damage. His testimony was measured and careful. He had walked through the storage room 3 days after the incident and had examined what remained. In his estimation, somewhat more than 2 measures had been lost or spoiled. Not 3, perhaps 2 1/4, if one was generous. He had brought Tirzah's prior purchases into consideration, and the numbers did not support a claim of 3 full measures. When the witnesses had finished, Shimon sat for a long moment in silence. The crowd watched him, waiting. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against him from both sides. The widow's grief and the young man's fear, the village's desire for someone to be declared right so that everyone could go home satisfied. But satisfaction was not the purpose of the gate. Truth was. He thought of his father, who had sat on this same stone, who had once told him that the most dangerous moment in any judgment, when the elder began to care more about being seen as just than about actually being just, when the crowd's approval became sweeter than the difficult taste of honest discernment. His father had said, "The man who judges to please the room will eventually please no one, because the room always wants more than fairness can give." Shimon rose to his feet. "I have heard the complaint and the answer. I have heard the witnesses. Now hear my judgment." The crowd pressed closer. "The damage is real. Nadav's goats entered Tirzah's land and destroyed grain she had stored for the coming winter. This is not disputed. A man's animals are his responsibility, and when they cause harm, he must make restitution. This is the way of shared life. Every household depends upon every other household to keep what is theirs from becoming a burden to their neighbor." He turned slightly toward Tirzah, but the amount claimed does not match the testimony of the merchant who saw the damage. "I believe Tirzah's distress is sincere. I believe her fear for the coming winter is real. But grief does not change the weight of what was lost. Sorrow does not increase the measure of grain that lay in that room before the animals entered. To demand more than what was taken, even from a place of genuine pain, is to seek more than justice. It is to make another man's pocket a remedy for one's own suffering, and that is not how the scale balances." He turned to Nadav. "And you will not dismiss her loss by pointing to the condition of her fence or the quality of her storage. Your goats, your responsibility. Negligence does not require malice. You allowed a gap to remain in the boundary between your lands, and your animals did what animals do. A man cannot live among his neighbors and refuse to account for what is his." Shimon paused. The verse did not say to do justice alone, nor to offer mercy alone. It bound them together, inseparable. Both of them held in the humility of knowing that no man's judgment was perfect. "My ruling is this: Nadav will pay restitution of 2 full measures of barley, to be delivered before the next new moon. This is what the scale shows when the weights are honest. A moment of stillness. She will starve. 20 days of labor? That is theft of his time?" Tirzah stepped forward, her face tight. "Elder, this is not enough. He has taken my security. 2 measures will not last me until spring. I asked for 5 because I will have to buy from the market now at winter prices, and those prices will rise. He has cost me more than the grain itself." Shimon nodded slowly. "I understand your fear, but the judgment seat does not compensate for what might happen. It measures what did happen. If I awarded you what your worry demands, I would punish Nadav not for what his goats did, but for what the market may or may not do in the coming months. That is not justice. That is fortune-telling, and I am not a prophet." Before she could respond, a voice rose from Nadav's supporters, harsh and mocking. "She has always wanted something from that family. Her husband borrowed tools and never returned them. Now she wants their son's labor too." Tirzah turned, her face flushing. "How dare you speak of my husband? He returned every tool, and you know it." The crowd surged forward. Someone shoved someone else. Shimon struck his staff against the stone 3 times, the sound ringing out sharp and clear. Enough." The crowd froze. When one of you destroys another's reputation with a word thrown in anger, you do not only wound that person, you poison the water that everyone drinks. He let the silence settle. He saw faces that had been twisted in fury begin to soften, not into agreement, but into something like shame. They remembered where they were. Shimon continued, his voice lower now, but no less firm. "The law we live by is not a weapon that one neighbor uses to crush another. It is a scale in which both sides place their grain, and we weigh it honestly, even when the weight disappoints us. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. I would rather you walk away from this gate, dissatisfied with my ruling, than walk away having watched me give you what you felt you deserved. Your feelings are not the measure. Truth is the measure. And truth this morning says that damage was done, that it will be paid for proportionately, and that both of you will go home and find a way to mend more than offense." He sat back down, slowly, feeling the ache in his knees that had grown worse over the past year. The ruling stands. 2 measures of barley before the new moon, or 20 days of labor thereafter. The gate is closed on this matter. The crowd reacted with the familiar unrest that always followed a difficult judgment. Some murmured that Tirzah had been shortchanged. Others insisted Nadav was being burdened unfairly. Shimon let the noise rise and fall, then lifted his staff once. The gathered voices quieted under the weight of his restraint. "Justice," he said, "does not flatter your loyalties." "It is difficult," she said quietly, "to lose what I depended on." "It is," Shimon replied, "but truth must still speak." Nadav stepped forward, face tight with worry. "I will bring the grain," he said, "before the new moon." "Bring it with a clean heart," Shimon said, "not as punishment, as responsibility." For a moment, both the widow and the young man looked at one another, not with affection and not with forgiveness, but with the sober recognition that neither had won and neither had lost. They had simply been required to face the truth together. The crowd dispersed, still divided in opinion, but calmer now. Sometimes it left everyone disappointed, but disappointment was not the measure. Fairness was. A modern echo sounded far from that ancient gate. In a bustling office, a supervisor paused before responding to a heated complaint between 2 coworkers. She wanted to appease one side quickly, to quiet the drama, but something in her resisted the easy answer. She waited. She listened to both. And in doing so, she kept her small corner of the world from tearing down what trust remained. Back at the gate, Shimon watched the last of the villagers walk away. The terebinth tree whispered overhead, its branches shifting in the afternoon breeze. He thought of the words he had learned long ago. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable than sacrifice. They felt heavier every year, yet truer. He gathered his staff and began the slow walk home. Tomorrow, the gate would open again. Tomorrow, someone else would stand before him with hurt and fear and outrage, wanting truth to favor their side. And tomorrow, as always, he would sit beneath the shade of the old tree and try once more to do what was fair when feelings conflicted, not because it pleased anyone, but because shared life depended on it.
Thank you for sharing this sacred story with me. If it touched your heart, you may also find peace and clarity in our Meditative Reflections playlist, a series of guided meditations inspired by these very Bible stories. Each one is crafted to help you slow down, breathe deeply, and connect more fully with God's presence in your life. Remember to subscribe, leave a comment if something resonated with you, and share this with someone who may need a little hope today. Until next time, transforming minds and empowering souls, and as always, peace, love, light, and unity.